Welcome to this deep dive into the world of Milton H. Erickson and uncommon therapy. You've specifically mentioned wanting to learn more about brief therapy, and Erickson really shook things up in the field with his unique approach.
That's very true. To appreciate how radical Erickson's ideas were, you have to remember that back in the mid 20th century, therapy was pretty much synonymous with psychoanalysis, long term, passive, focused on dredging up the past. Erickson, on the other hand, he was all about active intervention, finding solutions in the present, and achieving results quickly.
So he was kind of the opposite of the stereotypical therapist with the notepad
Yeah.
and the silent listening, right?
Mm.
But I'm curious, how did his background as a hypnotist factor into all this?
That's a good question. Well, in both hypnosis and therapy, you're dealing with a voluntary relationship. A person is coming to you for help, yet they might resist your guidance, even unconsciously. Erickson saw this parallel, and he brought his expertise in suggestion metaphor and even a touch of paradox from hypnosis into his therapy practice.
Okay, so there's this underlying idea of resistance, but let's get into specifics. What stands out to you as the most uncommon aspect of Erickson's therapy?
Hmm, that's a tough one, but for me, his use of metaphor and storytelling. He saw therapy as this collaborative process where you're not just analyzing problems, but weaving new narratives, new possibilities.
You're saying he treated therapy like a creative writing session? That's fascinating.
In a way, yes. And he wasn't just being whimsical. He believed that people actually live their lives through metaphors.
Like how we say, I'm stuck in a rut or I feel lost.
Exactly. And instead of dismissing those metaphors as just figures of speech, Erickson used them as a way to understand the patient's experience and even guide them towards change. There's this famous story about a patient who believed he was Jesus.
Didn't Erickson ask him about his carpentry skills?
Exactly. He met the patient where he was within his reality instead of trying to force him to abandon his delusion. And, that's a powerful lesson for any therapist. It's about respecting the patient's frame of reference, even if it seems illogical or strange.
So metaphors weren't just literary flourishes for Erickson. They were actual tools for understanding the person's inner world. And that understanding, I imagine, is crucial when you're dealing with the complexities of families.
Absolutely. And Erickson saw families as systems complex, interconnected with their own unique patterns and dynamics. He believed those patterns could become rigid and dysfunctional, almost like a trance.
So he was basically applying his knowledge of hypnosis to entire families.
Exactly. And one of his key aims was to create a healthy disengagement within families, particularly those with overly intense relationships. He often focused on these dyadic relationships, the one-on-one bonds where things had become too entangled.
You mean like a parent who's overly involved in their child's life?
Precisely. You see, Erickson saw parallels between awakening a hypnotic subject and guiding family members out of those overly intense bonds. He'd look for those hypnotic patterns in the family dynamic and then use his techniques to disrupt them to create space for individual growth.
So it's about disrupting the status quo, shaking things up a bit. It sounds like he had a real knack for seeing those hidden dynamics that might be driving conflict or dysfunction. And I guess that makes sense if you believe, like Erickson did, that families go through distinct stages, each with its own set of challenges.
That's right. He saw the family life cycle as this journey starting with courtship, moving into marriage, child rearing, and eventually the empty nest phase and old age. And each stage, he believed, presented its own unique set of hurdles that could lead to distress or even psychiatric symptoms if not handled well.
So you're saying that these seemingly individual problems could actually be rooted in the family stage of development. I'm starting to see how Erickson connected the dots between individual behavior and the larger family system. But let's unpack these stages, starting with courtship. Didn't Erickson have a unique take on in-laws?
He did. He pointed out that unlike most other animals, humans have in-laws, which adds this whole other layer of complexity to relationships. It's not just two individuals coming together, but two families, each with its own history, expectations, and ways of doing things.
So it's like those in-law jokes are actually pointing to a deep psychological truth that these extended family dynamics can make or break a relationship.
Exactly. And Erickson was particularly interested in how this web of relationships impacted a couple's ability to establish their own separate territory, both physically and emotionally. He saw it as a crucial step in forming a strong and healthy bond.
It makes you wonder how many relationship problems are actually rooted in those early struggles to navigate those complex family dynamics. You're basically merging two worlds, two sets of rules, and then, of course, you throw adolescence into the mix, which is already a time of upheaval and change.
Right. Adolescence is all about transitioning from childhood to adulthood, finding your own identity, separating from the family. And this, of course, can create a lot of tension within the family system.
It's like the family is trying to maintain its equilibrium while the adolescent is pushing for change, for independence. So how did Erickson approach this delicate stage?
Erickson saw adolescent turmoil not just as individual rebellion, but as a symptom of the family system struggling to adapt. It's like the family is a ship trying to sail in a new direction, and everybody's a bit seasick from the change.
So instead of just trying to control the rebellious teenager, he looked at the whole family dynamic. Did he have any specific techniques for working with families during this stage?
Well, one of his key approaches was to reframe the problem. Instead of viewing it as a battle between the teenager and the parents, he saw it as an opportunity for the family to evolve, to find a new balance that allowed for both individual growth and family connection.
It's like he was helping them rewrite the rules of the game to create a system where everyone could win.
Exactly. He was a master at finding those win-win solutions, those interventions that benefited everyone involved. And he often did this through indirect suggestion, through stories, metaphors, and even a bit of playful trickery.
That sounds intriguing. Can you give us an example?
Sure, remember that case you mentioned earlier, the young man with the fainting spells?
The one whose symptoms seemed to be connected to his family's resistance to his growing independence.
Precisely, Erickson didn't confront the family directly about their dynamics. Instead, he focused on the boy's fainting spells, suggesting that they were a sign of his strength and vitality, a way for him to release excess energy.
Wait, so he was basically praising the symptoms.
In a way, yes, but by reframing the symptoms in a positive light, he shifted the family's perception of the problem. The fainting spells were no longer seen as a sign of weakness or defiance, but as a natural part of the boy's development.
That's so clever. By changing the way they viewed the problem, he essentially neutralized it. And I bet that shift in perspective also opened up space for the family to communicate more openly about their needs and expectations.
You're absolutely right, and that's the beauty of Erickson's approach. It wasn't about imposing solutions from the outside, but about facilitating change from within the family system itself.
This is all making me realize how much traditional therapy focuses on the individual. Erickson, though, seems to have had this bigger picture view. He wasn't just treating symptoms, he was trying to help families become more functional, more adaptable.
That's a great observation. And speaking of adaptability, Erickson also recognized that families go through major transitions as children grow up and eventually leave the nest. This is where his concept of weaning comes into play. He saw this stage not as an ending, but as a transformation of the parent-child relationship.
So it's not about cutting ties completely, but about finding a new way to connect a more adult-to-adult relationship.
Exactly. He saw it as a ritual of re-engagement. Parents gain a grandchild, and the child transitions to a more mature connection with their parents. It's a natural progression, a way for the family system to continue evolving.
You mentioned earlier that you're interested in brief therapy. Well, this concept of re-engagement really highlights the efficiency of Erickson's approach. Instead of years of therapy focused on separation and individuation, he aimed to guide families towards this natural next phase.
Yes, and I think that's crucial for today's world where people are seeking faster solutions and a more collaborative approach to therapy.
Okay, so we've covered metaphors, family systems, stages of development, and this idea of re-engagement. It's clear that Erickson had a very unique and nuanced approach to therapy. But what about the role of hypnosis? It's a technique that often raises eyebrows, but it seems to have been central to his work.
Absolutely. Erickson saw hypnosis as a powerful tool for accessing the unconscious mind, for bypassing those conscious defenses and resistance that can block change. He used it to help people tap into their own inner resources to find solutions that were already within them.
It sounds almost mystical. Was he really swinging a pocket watch and saying, "You are getting sleepy"?
Not quite. Erickson's approach to hypnosis was very different from the stage hypnotism you might see in movies. He used a conversational style, weaving suggestions and metaphors into his interactions with patients.
So it was more subtle, more integrated into the therapy process.
Exactly. He wasn't trying to control people's minds, but to help them access their own unconscious potential for healing and growth. And he had some truly remarkable cases that illustrate the power of this approach.
Do you have a favorite example?
Well, there's a story of the woman who developed hysterical blindness after a fight with her husband.
Hysterical blindness. That sounds intense.
It's a condition where someone loses their sight without any physical cause, often due to extreme psychological stress. In this case, the woman's blindness was a way of avoiding the conflict with her husband.
So her body was literally shutting down to protect her from emotional pain. And how did Erickson approach this case?
He used hypnosis to help her access the unspoken emotions and unresolved conflicts that were driving her blindness. And as she began to process those feelings, her vision gradually returned.
So by addressing the underlying emotional issues, he was able to treat the physical symptom. It's amazing how the mind and body are so interconnected.
Absolutely, and this case really highlights Erickson's genius. He wasn't just treating symptoms, he was looking for the root cause, the underlying emotional dynamic that was driving the problem.
It's like he was a detective, carefully uncovering the clues and piecing together the story of the person's life to find the key to their healing.
That's a great analogy. And speaking of uncovering hidden potential, there's another case that really showcases Erickson's belief in the power of human resilience. He worked with a young man who had been labeled mentally defective.
That's a pretty harsh label. I can only imagine how limiting that must have felt.
It was, and yet Erickson saw something different in this young man. He saw potential, a spark of intelligence and creativity that had been overlooked by others.
So instead of accepting the label, he chose to challenge it.
Exactly, and he used hypnosis to help the young man access his own inner strength and intelligence. He guided him to develop his skills and talents, to believe in himself, and to see beyond the limitations that had been imposed upon him.
And what happened?
The results were astounding. This young man who had been written off by society went on to have a successful career and a fulfilling life. He defied all expectations, proving that labels can be incredibly limiting and that human potential is far greater than we often imagine.
It's a powerful reminder that we should never underestimate anyone's ability to grow and change, regardless of their circumstances. And it makes you wonder how many other people have been held back by limiting beliefs and labels.
That's a great point. And this case also highlights Erickson's deep compassion and his belief in the inherent worth and dignity of every individual he saw beyond the labels, beyond the surface, and recognized the unique spark of potential within each person he worked with.
It's truly inspiring, but I have to admit, some of his techniques sound a bit like trickery. Didn't he sometimes assign tasks that seemed counterintuitive or even absurd?
He did, and that was part of his genius. He understood that sometimes the best way to overcome resistance is to bypass it altogether by giving people tasks that seemed illogical or even silly. He was able to disrupt their habitual patterns of thinking and behavior, opening up new possibilities for change.
Can you give us an example?
Well, there's the famous case where he encouraged a young woman who was very self-conscious about her appearance to wear mismatched shoes and clothes to college.
Whoa, that's bold. I can't imagine how uncomfortable that must have been for her.
It was definitely outside her comfort zone, but Erickson knew that her self-consciousness was holding her back socially. He believed that by confronting her fear in such a dramatic way, she would realize that the consequences weren't as dire as she imagined.
So it was like a form of exposure therapy, facing her fears head on.
Exactly, and it worked by deliberately drawing attention to herself in this unconventional way. She actually became less self-conscious. She realized that people weren't judging her as harshly as she thought, and she began to embrace her own unique style.
It's like he was giving her permission to be different, to stand out from the crowd.
Right. And it's a reminder that sometimes the best way to overcome our fears is to lean into them, to challenge our assumptions about what's acceptable and what's not.
I'm starting to see how Erickson's playful, almost mischievous approach could be incredibly effective in disrupting those rigid patterns of thinking that can keep us stuck. It's like he was shaking people out of their ruts and helping them see the world with fresh eyes.
Exactly. And he was also a master at using humor to disarm resistance and create a more playful, less threatening atmosphere in therapy. He understood that laughter could be a powerful tool for healing and growth.
This all reminds me of that story where he told a young woman to squirt water on her office crush.
It's
That's definitely not your typical therapy advice.
certainly not conventional, but Erickson saw an opportunity to help the woman overcome her shyness and create a connection with the man she was interested in.
So it was like a playful way to break the ice and initiate interaction.
Exactly, and it worked. The unexpected gesture created a spark of humor and connection, and the relationship blossomed from there.
I love that it's a reminder that sometimes the most effective solutions are the ones that surprise us, the ones that break the rules and challenge our expectations.
And that's one of the things that makes Erickson's work so fascinating. He was always pushing the boundaries, always finding new and creative ways to help people heal and grow.
Speaking of pushing boundaries, Erickson wasn't afraid to tackle sensitive topics like sexual difficulties within marriage. This was an area that was often taboo back then, but he recognized its importance for overall well-being.
Absolutely. He saw sexual fulfillment as a vital part of a healthy relationship, and he approached these issues with the same sensitivity and creativity he brought to all his work.
Didn't he have a case where a husband was unable to consummate his marriage due to performance anxiety?
He did, and instead of focusing on the problem itself, Erickson shifted the focus to the couple's connection to the emotional intimacy that underpinned their sexual relationship. He used metaphors and stories to help them relax, to let go of their anxieties, and to rediscover the joy and pleasure of being together.
It sounds like he was creating a safe space for them to explore their intimacy without judgment or pressure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this is a key element of Erickson's approach to sexual difficulties. He understood that these issues were often rooted in shame, guilt, and fear of failure by creating a compassionate and understanding environment. He helped people feel more comfortable exploring their sexuality and finding solutions that work for them.
So it wasn't just about techniques. It was about creating a therapeutic relationship built on trust and respect. And that, I imagine, is crucial when you're dealing with such sensitive issues.
Absolutely. And Erickson was also a master at using metaphors and imagery to help people overcome sexual difficulties. He understood that the unconscious mind responds well to symbolic language, and he used this to his advantage.
Can you give us an example?
Sure, there's the case where he helped a man with premature ejaculation by using the metaphor of a train journey. He suggested that the man imagine himself as the conductor of a train, carefully controlling the speed and timing of the journey.
I love that it's such a vivid and relatable metaphor, and I can see how it helps someone feel more in control of their sexual responses.
Exactly. And by using this metaphorical language, Erickson was able to bypass the man's conscious anxieties
Wow.
and access his unconscious ability to regulate his sexual responses.
It's remarkable how he could use language to create such profound shifts in people's experience.
It really is, and his work with sexual difficulties is a testament to his understanding of the complex interplay between the mind, the body, and the emotions.
Okay, so we've seen how Erickson used metaphors, hypnosis, and even a bit of playful trickery to address a wide range of issues, from individual anxieties to family conflicts and even sexual difficulties. But let's go back to that concept of the family as a system. Didn't he have a particular interest in the dynamics of parental over-involvement?
He did. He recognized that while parents naturally want the best for their children, sometimes their attempts to protect and control can actually hinder their child's development.
So it's that age-old dilemma.
Yeah.
How do you balance support with allowing your child to develop their own independence?
Exactly. And Erickson saw this as a delicate dance, one that required parents to be mindful of their own needs and motivations as well as their child's.
Didn't he have a case where he helped a young woman overcome her crippling anxiety about motherhood?
He did, and in this case, the woman's anxiety stemmed from her own mother's over-involvement in her life. She had never really felt like she could make her own decisions or stand on her own 2 feet.
So her mother's well-intentioned efforts to protect her had actually created a sense of dependency and insecurity. And how did Erickson approach this situation?
He recognized that the young woman needed to develop a stronger sense of self-efficacy, a belief in her own ability to handle the challenges of motherhood, and he used a combination of techniques to help her achieve this.
Such as,
Well, he encouraged her to start making small, independent decisions in her daily life, to assert her own needs and preferences, even in situations where she felt uncomfortable. He also used metaphors and stories to help her reframe her fears and anxieties about motherhood, seeing them as challenges she could overcome rather than threats to her well-being.
so it was about empowering her to take control of her own life, to trust in her own abilities.
Exactly. And as she gained confidence in her own capabilities, her anxiety about motherhood began to dissipate. She realized that she was stronger and more resilient than she thought, and that she could handle the challenges of parenthood with grace and competence.
It's a powerful example of how therapy can help us break free from the limiting beliefs that hold us back and tap into our own inner resources.
And this case also highlights Erickson's understanding of the family as a system. He recognized that the young woman's anxiety wasn't just an individual problem, but a reflection of the dynamic between her and her mother.
So he was treating the system, not just the symptom.
Precisely. And by helping the young woman develop a stronger sense of self, he was also shifting the balance of power within the family system, creating a healthier and more functional dynamic.
It's fascinating how he could see those interconnected patterns and create interventions that addressed the root cause of the problem, rather than just the symptoms.
That's what made him such a brilliant therapist. He had this uncanny ability to see the bigger picture, to understand how individual behavior was connected to the larger social and familial context.
This deep dive into Erickson's work is really giving me a whole new perspective on therapy. I'm starting to see how it's not just about talking about your problems, but about actively creating change, about rewriting the narratives that shape our lives.
That's a great way to put it. And Erickson's legacy is a reminder that therapy can be a truly creative and transformative process, one that empowers us to live more fulfilling and authentic lives.
And speaking of transformation, I'm curious about how his techniques might be adapted to address the unique challenges faced by families. In today's world, we live in such a different time with technology, social media, and all the pressures of modern life. It seems like the stakes are even higher now.
You're right, the world has changed dramatically since Erickson's time, but I think the fundamentals of human behavior and relationships remain remarkably consistent. We still long for connection, for belonging, for meaning and purpose, and those are the very things that Erickson's work addresses.
So you're saying that even though the context has changed, his principles and techniques are still relevant.
Absolutely. His emphasis on communication, on understanding the individual's perspective, on utilizing indirect suggestions and metaphors,
Hmm.
these are all timeless tools that can be incredibly effective in addressing a wide range of contemporary issues.
Okay, but how would you apply his techniques to something like technology addiction, which is so prevalent today?
Well, instead of simply imposing limits on screen time, which often leads to resistance and rebellion, you could use Erickson's techniques to help families understand the underlying needs being met by technology. What is the child seeking through their online interactions? Is it connection, escape, validation?
So it's about going deeper, looking beyond the behavior itself to understand the motivations behind it.
Exactly. And once you understand those underlying needs, you can start to find healthier ways to meet them. Maybe the child needs more opportunities for face-to-face interaction, for creative expression, for physical activity.
It's like shifting the focus from controlling the technology to enriching the child's life in ways that make technology less appealing.
Precisely. And you can use Erickson's techniques to make that process more engaging and collaborative, for example. You could use metaphors and stories to help the child understand the impact of technology on their well-being.
I'm picturing a story about a family who gets so lost in their virtual world that they forget how to connect with each other in real life.
That's a great example. And by engaging the child's imagination, you're more likely to spark their interest and motivation to change.
I'm starting to see how Erickson's approach could be adapted to address a wide range of modern challenges. What about social media? It's such a huge part of young people's lives, and it can be incredibly difficult for parents to navigate.
Right. And I think Erickson's understanding of family systems and his ability to identify and disrupt unhealthy patterns of interaction could be incredibly valuable in this context.
Can you give us an example?
Sure, let's say a family is constantly arguing about screen time and social media. A therapist using Erickson's approach might observe how those arguments are playing out, how they're reinforcing certain dynamics within the family. Maybe the child is using social media to seek validation and attention because they're not getting enough from their parents, or maybe the parents are overly critical of their child's online presence because they're anxious about the dangers of the internet.
So it's about looking beneath the surface, understanding the unspoken emotions and motivations that are driving the conflict.
Exactly. And then instead of trying to control the child's behavior directly, which often backfires, the therapist might use indirect suggestions or paradoxical interventions to shift the dynamic.
What would that look like?
Well, imagine a therapist suggesting that a teenager spend even more time on social media, but with a specific purpose. Maybe they're tasked with observing how it makes them feel, how it impacts their mood, their sleep, their relationships. The goal is to increase their self-awareness and help them make more conscious choices about their social media use.
That's so clever. It's like you're turning the problem on its head, using the child's resistance to your advantage.
Exactly, and by giving them a sense of agency and control, you're more likely to foster lasting change.
I'm starting to see how Erickson's playful, indirect approach could be incredibly effective in addressing some of the most challenging issues facing families today. But it also seems like it requires a lot of skill and creativity on the part of the therapist.
It does, and that's one of the reasons why Erickson's work continues to inspire and challenge therapists around the world. He was a true master of his craft, and his legacy is a reminder that therapy can be an art form, a creative and collaborative process that empowers individuals and families to heal and grow.
I'm really appreciating this deeper understanding of Erickson's approach. But before we wrap up this section, I have one more question. We've been talked a lot about families, but didn't Erickson also work extensively with individuals? What were some of the unique challenges and triumphs he encountered in those cases?
Absolutely. Erickson's work with individuals was just as impactful and insightful as his work with families, and in many ways, his approach to individual therapy reflected the same principles and techniques we've been discussing. He believed in meeting people where they were, in respecting their unique experiences and perspectives, and in empowering them to find their own solutions. He also recognized the powerful role that the unconscious mind plays in shaping our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and he used hypnosis and other indirect techniques to access those deeper levels of awareness and facilitate change.
It's amazing how he seemed to weave together so many different threads, from psychology and hypnosis to storytelling, and even a bit of philosophy.
It truly is, and I think that's what makes his work so enduring. He was constantly pushing the boundaries, exploring new ideas, and challenging conventional ways of thinking about therapy. And in doing so, he created a legacy that continues to inspire and inform therapists around the world.
Well, this deep dive has been an absolute eye-opener. I feel like I've gained a whole new understanding of Erickson's approach and the potential of therapy to create real and lasting change.
Me too. It's been a fascinating journey exploring his work and seeing how his ideas can be applied to the challenges we face today.
And on that note, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll wrap up our exploration of Milton H. Erickson and uncommon therapy with some final thoughts and reflections.
Welcome back to our deep dive into uncommon therapy and the brilliant mind of Milton H. Erickson. As we wrap up this deep dive, it's striking how relevant his work feels. Even decades later, we've covered so much ground, from his use of metaphor and hypnosis to his understanding of family dynamics and his emphasis on brief therapy, which I know is of particular interest to you.
Erickson's legacy is truly remarkable. He wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo, to think outside the box and create therapeutic interventions that were as unique and unconventional as he was.
He seemed to have this incredible knack for seeing the world differently, for finding solutions where others saw only problems.
Exactly. And that unconventional thinking, combined with his deep empathy and his ability to connect with people on a human level, made him a truly exceptional therapist. One of the things that really stood out to me was his sensitivity to cultural and societal influences. He understood that therapy doesn't exist in a vacuum, that it needs to take into account the wider context in which people live their lives, that feels especially important today, given the complexities and challenges we face as a society.
You're absolutely right, and Erickson's work offers a valuable framework for navigating those complexities. His emphasis on understanding the individual's unique story, their cultural background, their beliefs and values, it's all incredibly relevant for therapists working with diverse populations today.
Do you have a favorite example of how Erickson integrated cultural sensitivity into his work?
Well, there's the story of the Native American family who was hesitant to engage in traditional talk therapy. They found it too intrusive, too focused on individual problems rather than the collective well-being of the family and community.
That makes sense. Different cultures have different ways of approaching healing and problem solving.
Exactly. So instead of forcing them into a model that didn't fit their cultural norms, Erickson adapted his approach. He used storytelling metaphors and rituals that resonated with their traditions and beliefs.
It's a powerful example of how culturally sensitive therapy can be truly transformative by meeting people where they are, by honoring their unique experiences and perspectives. We create a space for authentic healing and growth.
It's also a reminder that therapy isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. We need to be flexible, adaptable, and willing to step outside our comfort zones to meet the needs of our clients.
Speaking of stepping outside our comfort zones as we wrap up this deep dive, I'd love to hear your final thoughts on Erickson's legacy. What's the most important takeaway for you? What do you hope listeners will carry with them from this exploration of uncommon therapy?
For me, it's the reminder that there are no limits to human potential. Erickson believed in the inherent capacity for change within each individual, regardless of their circumstances, and he demonstrated time and time again that even the most challenging problems can be overcome with creativity, compassion, and a willingness to embrace the unexpected.
That's a beautiful message to end on. Erickson's work is a testament to the power of human resilience, the transformative power of therapy, and the importance of approaching life and relationships with a sense of curiosity, playfulness, and a willingness to challenge conventional ways of thinking.
And for those of you listening, I encourage you to delve deeper into Erickson's work. Read his books, explore his cases, and allow yourself to be inspired by his unconventional wisdom and his unwavering belief in the human spirit.
Thank you so much for joining us on this journey into the fascinating world of Milton H. Erickson. We hope you found it as enlightening and inspiring as we have.
And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.